Hello, and welcome to the Ropen Radio Network. I'm your host, Jacob Guerra. Folklore. The traditional beliefs, customs, and stories of a community that have been passed through the generations by word of mouth. Are the stories real or just fiction? In order to understand this more, one may have to separate myth from legend. The word myth actually comes from the Greek word mythos, meaning word of mouth. Myths were shared by groups of people all throughout the world and became a really big part of their community. Legends, on the other hand, are about real life people and what they did. Legends always have an important purpose, but the facts are sometimes a little exaggerated to make them more interesting and exciting. Regardless, legends tend to yield more credibility than myth. Such is the case of the haunting of Cashen's Gap, also known as Jeff the Dalby Spook, or Jeff the Talking Mongoose. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this very old cryptid that first appeared in the 1930s. And I'm quite excited to be able to speak about it. We are working on a documentary creature feature we released in the month of April or May. But this is kind of a very complex case, especially if you're doing filmmaking for it. So I thought it'd be best to do something just a little bit different this time. We've chosen to go with a podcast for you to listen in on and decide for yourself. I'm about to go over quite a bit of things regarding this creature. And at the end of the day, it's up to you to decide if he's real or fiction. At the very end, I'll give my final analysis as to what I think Jeff actually is. Sit back, relax, as we go over this pretty unique, fascinating case. For many, and then for some, very few, quite troublesome. The case of Jeff, the alleged talking mongoose, which may or may not have been a poltergeist, or a ghost, or a hoax, or any one of the several things, took place over a period of around 8 years on a remote farm on the Isle of Man in the 1930s. Located in the Irish Sea between England and Ireland, this isle has had rugged coastlines with pebble beaches. The highest point is 2,030 feet, with a population of 83,314, according to the General Census. The phenomena was investigated by Harry Price, Nander Fodor, and other researchers. But there was never a definitive conclusion as to what was going on. Just a little history now. The year was 1931, autumn to be exact, Doarlish Cashen. This is a very isolated area, 2 miles from the town of Dalby, and a good distance from the town of Peel. The family whom this apparent form attached itself to was known as the Irvings. The father, James, Margaret, the wife, and daughter, Voiry, from whom Jeff seemed to mostly attach himself to. The community was a farming rural area where the Irving family originated from, Liverport. It was at this time a small animal appeared to the family. It seemed to have the power of speech within a few weeks. Jeff became extremely comfortable with the family. He began to sing and laugh and tell jokes. He even found himself enjoying idle gossip from visitors of the area. Jeff would usually report back to the family, mostly Voiry, about his findings. Word began to spread that there was a talking animal staying with the Irving family. Quite a few people claimed to have heard this talking animal speak and have seen it. Well, on a few occasions, personally. was at this point people realized that they were engaging in conversations with the talking mongoose. Some were even able to capture photographs of the alleged animal. We have seen evidence of that. Now, by the year 1932, this was beginning to become quite the stir, so the local newspapers from Manchester were dispatched in hopes of attaining a one-of-a-kind story. This is where men like Harry Price and Nander Fodor became extremely involved. Setting up base as paranormal investigators, the strange occurrence by Jeff went on for nearly 8 years. My personal introduction to Jeff probably was in the early 90s when I opened a book called The Osbournes' World of the Unknown, titled Ghosts. From henceforth, my fascination with Jeff grew, providing reason for discussion. Now I see this case as that it is colliding with very traditional farming way of life. For instance, their father, James Irving, worked with a successful piano organ company based in Canada. He did travel back and forth, but seemed to be plunged into this very Celtic culture. A good majority of the time, Jeff spoke about spirits and goblins. Nothing new if you live on the Isle of Man. Voirrey was 12 years of age at the time. She was often reported wandering the hills talking to herself or even talking with other animals. Voirrey was no doubt an animal lover, which is why Jeff attached himself to her more so than the father or mother. Now, Voirrey was quite intelligent. She had a fascination with technology, much like her father. These fascinations kind of mirrored Jeff's own, so to speak. James was very interested in different languages. Now, this could stem from the fact that they were very isolated. They would often go to the airport and watch the planes pass, thus providing technological desires. Let me touch base on the psychological aspects. Others have speculated that mental illness could have played a factor in the case of a talking mongoose. This was proven to be inconclusive, however, as psychological journalists personally tested the Irving family and found no evidence to support this. Even eyewitnesses to Jeff, numbering 10 to 20, mentioned seeing a little furry animal wandering around with Voirrey as they spoke to one another. How about samples and evidence? There is some of that. Now, when Harry Price investigated in 1935 to 1936, roughly, he was able to obtain hair samples of Jeff, which are wonderfully preserved in the Cambridge University Library. So you can go there to this day and you can find them. Harry also gathered samples from the Irving family sheepdog, Mona, which he had analyzed 2 samples by an expert. And sure enough, they were identical. So there's potential for hoaxing. Yes. The second piece of evidence was Jeff's paw prints. They were obtained in a plaster scene which was cast by Reginald Pocock from the Natural History Museum. What makes this so fascinating is that the 2 front paws were much bigger than his rear paws, which is quite odd. Yes. Jeff mentioned that this made things easier for him so he could steal objects from local farms. And there currently is no other animal with such a disparity of paws. That is correct. You can look this up. Quite odd having the 2 front ones larger. This is what led to some to believe that this was nothing more than a crude hoax. Although Jeff defended his earthly representative, shielding, "Don't you dare upset Jimmo with any skeptical remarks." Those are his words, to be exact. The photographs of Jeff seemed to change here and there. The pics were mostly captured by individuals of the community. And in my personal professional opinion, this really does not prove the entirety of the case. No, it doesn't. James Irving really took the time to study Jeff's daily doings over the course of 3 years. Who wouldn't? I mean, he's a talking mongoose. You don't see that every day. If the mother and daughter were by chance perpetuating a hoax, it would have been discovered by James Irving quickly. Not to say James did not like the attention, as very wealthy visitors come from a far distance just to lay his eyes on Jeff. Again, we have an individual who may crave the limelight in some way. This is a very isolated place, the Isle of Man, the 1930s. So there's not much out there. And possibly there may have been a connection for the mother and daughter, as I'll get to in a moment. But first, let me dive into James, or Jim, as some have called him. Did he concoct a hoax? Well, it's possible, but let's see. James Irving described to be the cosmopolitan man. This may have played a part in his desire to fit into the wealthy society. But James tends to hold himself much higher in standards. In his letters, he sees himself much more than the average Manx farmer. That's the expression they have on the Isle of Man. Also fascinating is when he moved to the island. He joined the local Freemason lodge. I'm not going to dive into that. I think you all could know where I'm going to go with Freemasonry. Some people consider it to be a wonderful thing, but I tend to think of it as a cult. But I'm going to leave it at that. Now, this may have played a significant part in getting in with the local middle class. James seems to be a very frustrated man, starved of intellectual status. He was very keen on getting a hold of books and magazines. One of the noteworthy books James owned was titled Hindu Magic by Hereward Carrington. Well, that's fascinating in itself, isn't it? Really fascinating. As this would imply that perhaps James was dabbing into the occult. Now, I want everybody to understand something. As an investigator, we do kind of collect these things. I personally have some old books. One was titled Haunted Heartland that really got me fascinated into parapsychology back in the day. The other is the Osborne book and a few others, Ghostly Animals, ordered by Fate magazine. That doesn't mean that you're dabbing into the occult. It means you're fascinated with an occurrence. It means you're fascinated with the supernatural. But you also have a balance and a time when you have to cut it off. But this is kind of a hint, Hindu magic, that would lead us to believe that maybe there was a conjuring here. Perhaps. The Irving family was not well-to-do. James did not seem to have benefited financially from Jeff's story, although he could have, but many times turned down a great deal of money. Yep. Spiritualists and mediums became quite interested in the case. Well, I don't see why they wouldn't be. James insisted that there was nothing supernatural or paranormal about this. His quote was, "I am very sane." Well, we're not doubting that one, James. He believes that it is very possible that animals can talk. Others believe that Jeff is an earthbound spirit. More likely. I'm going to step away from James for a moment here, and let's talk about Margaret and Voirrey. Margaret has very little to do here, but still she's a part of the family, and there may be a connection. Let's find out. One thing is for certain, we hear very little about the two of them. People mentioned that when they visited the house, they would usually have a chance to speak their minds, but James usually followed with a stern look, almost implying them to shut their mouths. James seems to be very much the mediator, which would make us all suspicious of him. Voirrey saw Jeff as more of a playmate or protector. After all, this is a young girl who's fascinated with animals, as we all are. She was unfortunately ridiculed and made fun of in school by her fellow classmates. Now, if you're isolated on the Isle of Man, you're going to feel even more isolated and alone after that. Over time, as Voirrey became older, she grew to find Jeff as more of a nuisance. It continued to be alarming as to what Jeff's true nature or motive was. There are words exchanged by Voirrey and Jeff. She told him that he was most likely a man at some point in time, then became an animal, to which Jeff responded with the contradictories for anyone who has studied parapsychology, as I have for a short amount of time. You would know that this is exactly the sort of things to which entities tend to do. Contradict themselves. Let's get to the main protagonist now. Let's get to the main character, Jeff. I will say he is very mundane, folks. Most spirits or poltergeists would use prophecy to explain themselves. But Jeff does nothing of those things. As a matter of fact, he speaks of stealing an egg or listening to conversations. Some people would say he knows a little too much. One of his most famous quotes is,
"I'm a freak. I have hands and I have feet. And if you saw me, you'd faint. You'd be petrified, mummified, turned into stone, or a pillar of salt. I am the fifth dimension. I am the eighth wonder of the world,"
said Jeff. Some of these lines he has are just too much. There were occasional conversations Jeff had with the family about life after death, which he preferred not to speak of at all. Jeff insisted that James Irving get rid of a ghost book that was in the house. There was even a time when James used a sheet pretending to be a ghost, and this frightened Jeff, and he insisted James remove the sheet at once. Upon the removal of the sheet, James said to him, "It's all right, it's just me." At this point, Jeff apparently was crying with relief. This is quite odd, again, seeing that he is supposed to be an earthbound spirit. During a time in 1932, Jeff appeared to James in the form of a striped cat with a large bulldog-like head. That sounds hideous. Most of the time, Jeff was extremely helpful around the house. He was very attached to the farm, and on occasion would catch rabbits for the family and look out for the lost sheep. But he also was very touchy and irritable. Occasionally, here and there, he would let out a loud cry, "Vanished!" The Irving family was quite puzzled by this and did ask him what he meant by the phrase, or where he went when he uttered the word. Jeff stated,
"I go back to the underworld."
Jeff also spoke of the word hell, or the land of mist, quite frequently. Should we be surprised? The irritable mongoose had a long conversation with the family, stating that he was originally from Egypt during 2 dynasties. Okay, so we're getting to a climax here, an ending, and we'll try to sort this out. Over the course of time, the family eventually sold the farm and moved on. But during those years, the visits by Jeff became less frequent, and eventually he was gone without a trace. According to the local newspaper and the original owner, ex-military by the way, the owner of the property came back after the Irving family had gone, and he had reported seeing a large critter scurrying about on the grounds, to which he claims he trapped and killed. It was suggested that it was Jeff, but upon examination, it was a polecat. Okay, a polecat. But Jeff had mentioned he can take different forms, right? This was apparently much smaller than Jeff because Jeff was said to be 9 inches with a 6-inch tail. Could it be that Jeff was in the form of something else completely different during his untimely death? Yeah. Reports came in that the neighboring folk heard sounds near the farm, as if someone were talking to themselves. During the early 1970s, 1971 to be exact, the original owners demolished the farmhouse, and to this day there are just small mounds of rubble that remain. James Irving passed away in 1945. So I'm guessing that they left the farm during that time of his passing. Now, after Jeff had disappeared back in the 30s, late 30s, there were apparitions that were being seen as I think the broom started to move. As soon as James Irving passed, the broom moved. A gust of wind. Curious. I'm not so sure that happened on the Isle of Man, though. This may have happened somewhere else. I don't have the full details on that, but that is something that did occur. In conclusion, what is quite strange is that Jeff has been forgotten in this local town of Dalby. There once stood a pub that had the only picture of him, but this pub has since closed. There's no aftermath, no tourist trade that was brought on by the presence of him, and in time, Jeff has been largely forgotten. Now, it wasn't until 1971 that Voirrey Irving, I take that back. It wasn't until 1970 that Voirrey Irving had broken her silence. Walter McGraw from Fate magazine had a chance to interview her. I'm surprised that she actually took the time to talk with him. For most whom anticipated her interview, the majority were shocked to discover that she never recanted on the events of those years. No. Instead, Voirrey does not cherish his memory. She says, Jeff was very detrimental to my life. I wish he would have let us alone. Well, after what she went through? Yeah. It kind of reminds me of my wife buying the recent puppy we have, a Springer Spaniel. Love him to death, but you know what? He whines a lot. He's only a year old, but he whines like crazy. He wants to go for walks. He wants to be played with a certain way, then go for walks again, played with a certain way, then he crashes and he's done. Talk about a workout. But you can see how that becomes detrimental to someone's life. They get sick of it. But that's a responsibility. In this case, you have some sort of strange entity or talking mongoose that tells you what to do and people to meet so they can make fun of you. Imagine how that took a toll on her life. Feeling alone. According to Celtic folklore, the Isle of Man harbors many variations of spirits, resembling that of good and evil. But mostly evil folks. One that I have mentioned in my recordings is Yokapi, a water spirit. If you recall the video about the Jersey Devil. Another is the Bugan, a Scandinavian troll. Yeah, that's out there too. Few cryptids. Also, people mention forest witches that have been said to inhabit the area too. I'm not sure what areas, but they're said to be out there. Ireland and England are riddled with superstition and fear. There is solid evidence to support that these two countries dealt heavily in sorcery and spellcasting. It is my professional opinion that Jeff the Talking Mongoose was able to obtain the power of speech through these practices. I'm coming to understand that that's a possibility, but this is an opinion of mine, okay? Now, from a Christian perspective, when I say Christian, I mean like Baptist or something like that, along those lines, not Catholicism. The Bible references on a few occasions of animals speaking. One such case is the story of Balaam and the donkey. Numbers 22:28, King James Version. The Lord opened the mouth of the donkey so that it would speak to Balaam. Now, naturally, you would think that this is quite a feat to behold, but no. Instead, Balaam continues to have a conversation with the animal as if it was no surprise to have it utter words back. Is it possible that this man had heard animals speak before? Yeah, why not? But to have a mule say those things to you is quite impressive. He's not a small critter. He's not a bird, as we're about to get to. We know that children acquire language quickly and easily and without effort or formal teachings. We also know there are some amazing avian birds that possess the ability of speech as well, but through time and by listening to their masters. They do not require lip movement. And at first, one would assume it was almost telepathic. Some have observed to have a vocabulary of almost 2,000 words. Parrots are a prime example of these attributes. If you've ever owned a parrot, I had one in the past. Pain in the butt. I should never taught him how to talk. Some birds lacking vocal cords are thought to make tones and sounds using throat muscles and membranes. But does this social learning apply to weasels or mongooses? That's a good question. The Bible states that in the beginning everything was perfect. One can only interpret for a fact that the animals could speak to Adam as he named them one by one. Jeff is not the only talking critter that caused quite a stir. Oh no, folks. A talking weasel had been reported in a carnival event prior to his arrival. Perhaps it was really Jeff in a different form? Could have been, as again, I'm leaning towards some sort of shape-shifting abilities. Some recent evidence had surfaced in 1976 prior to World War I. A farmer on the Isle of Man had released mongooses in the area to bring down the rabbit population. Oh, what a big mistake. Okay, first of all, that's not something they're going to do. As soon as they get into their territory, they're going to take over that territory. They're not going to go and wipe out a population of rabbits. They're going to conquer this area and set and create home for themselves. That was a big mistake. Rule number one. And if you are a zoologist, you'll know what I mean. Is it possible that a weasel mated with a mongoose and its descendants would have most certainly looked like, well, Jeff? Maybe. It would certainly explain the hybrid body form, but would still not explain the ability of speech. In conclusion, and studying the evidence, one would assume the entire case is a hoax, and that James Irving concocted it in an attempt to fit into high society. At least for a short time. No. I don't believe that for a moment. Not to say it's not possible, but I have chosen to rule out based on the information. Was Voiry a talented ventriloquist, or did she suffer psychologically? I find neither of these stories to be the case, as Voiry mentioned in her interview in 1970 that she wished Jeff would let them alone. Upon her passing in 2005, Voiry still maintained that Jeff was a real talking mongoose, and that nothing would shake her of it. When she passed away in 2005, Manx Radio actually had a chance to interview Kathleen Green. I know this because I went and did some thorough research and did some digging and investigating. And when you're an investigator, you have certain software programs that can actually lead you to certain people to find out this information. I'm going to get a chance possibly to speak to those who spoke to her. But Kathleen Green was a cousin to Voiry. And she said that her cousin was a very accomplished ventriloquist who had the ability to throw her voice. Let me think on this one for a moment, okay? Let's come back to that. Folks, I do believe that Jeff is a spirit of some sort. Though he maintains his helpful self quite well, he makes strange references to the underworld, or the fifth dimension, as he calls it. Jeff also states that,
I could kill you all, but I won't.
That's creepy. He calls himself a freak, and upon leaving, saying out loud,
I'm vanished.
Jeff is certainly not a being I would consider heaven sent, but more of a spirit trapped between two dimensions, the realm of the living as well as the dead. Jeff mentions that before he was a mongoose, he was a weasel, and before that, of a cat from Egyptian dynasty. Could we possibly assume that he may have been a man at one point in time that was cursed to wander in animal form? If you believe in curses. Regardless of his helpful but touching nature, it is noticeably clear that The Irving family was dealing with an entity of some sort, perhaps a condemned fallen spirit that was terrified of his fate upon the arrival of the second coming. Jeff states many times that he is not a spirit. Jeff is afraid of ghosts. The Bible warns us in God's word to stay away from witchcraft and sorcery, and this is all for good reason. Allegiance to such crafts yield dangerous consequences of opening gateways to other dimensions. Items such as board games, tarot cards, and the use of seances to which are considered harmless to the unrepentant or godless naysayer. They become a beacon for the interdimensional beings who are ready and waiting to devour the next soul who does not heed the warning. If Jeff was indeed real, then he was not of God. And his demeanor and presence prove just that. You need not look much further than Voirrey Irving. Her interview testifies that her life in the span of those 8 years was in some case a tragic, lonely time. Yes, and no child should have to go through something like that, but she did. And then she can come back and tell all about it. These are things that, now some people say, okay, well, hold on, Jake. You are talking about supernatural beings here. You are lifting it up. Well, hold on. Actually, we're exposing it. It's very different from being a paranormal investigator or a parapsychologist going out there and coming across a ghost and telling it that it needs to befriend somebody or just needs to leave. Actually, guys, what we're supposed to be doing, if you're going to be a parapsychologist, why not get out there and get rid of the spirit, eradicate it? Because Ephesians 5 tells us not to dwell on the things of the darkness, but expose it for what it really is. So on this network, I'm going to expose it for what it is. The way I see it, it's just my opinion. You don't have to take it as gospel truth, but this is my opinion on how we should deal with entities and spirits. They are all about trying to confuse and manipulate you to think they are on your side, but they are not. Jeff, in the situation of Jeff, we have a critter that comes across all sweet and does things, but wants something in return. A heaven-sent being comes with clarity, with kindness, with instruction, to help, to aid. God is not confusion, guys. So this is what leads me in this final analysis to believe that Jeff is a shape-shifting poltergeist, if you can put the two together. Or he's just a poltergeist. Again, the Isle of Man has a lot of things in that place. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't go there and enjoy a vacation there or enjoy the beauty of the island. No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying this is the history. It's worth looking into, okay? Now, as far as Kathleen Green, she says that her cousin was an accomplished ventriloquist, that she could throw her voice. This has been debunked, and this is a fact. Can you throw your voice in a room to make them think that the object is somewhere else in the room? Absolutely. However, there's a difference between throwing your voice in a room and throwing your voice in another part of the building or in an opposite room. Keep in mind this home, this house, was made of like concrete. So this method was debunked. So to say that she was a very well-accomplished ventriloquist is false. We have eyes watching her. We have eyewitnesses who saw her talking to a mongoose and the mongoose talking back. These people were interviewed, by the way. And all this information you can easily go and look up. It's quite fascinating. There is a book that you can check out that is so much details that you could read that I can't go into because it's so long. But it has all the history of him interacting with cousins, relatives, farmers, you name it. It's a wonderful book, but it's hard to get. It's very rare, but it's out there. And it is Jeff, the case of the extra special talking mongoose. If you get a chance to purchase that on Amazon or all the other sites, go for it. It's a good book. I was fortunate enough to grab one. It hasn't arrived yet, but it's so chock full of information that it could go on for hours, me talking about it. Can't do that. We're going to make this quite simple. So stay tuned. We're going to do a documentary on this story. and try to do it and explain it the best we can. But for now, I hope you enjoyed this little folklore podcast dealing with the Dalby spook, also known as Jeff, the talking mongoose. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Hope you enjoyed this show. Folklore Month will continue in the year 2022, but for now, we're going to put it to rest and be ready to move on to the next subjects. A lot of things coming on the docket. It should be quite entertaining. I'm going to go ahead and leave you now. In the meantime, seek the truth, and God bless every one of you on the other side of this screen. Thank you for listening on the Ropen Radio Network. I'm your host, Jacob Guerra. So long for now.
This is Jeff, the Dalby Spook. I'm gonna steal Jake's sandwiches and ride a roping into the portal. Thanks for the grubbo, Jake. Later, chump.